The merciless August sun hammered down on the cracked earth like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the Arizona desert into a furnace that seemed to breathe fire with every gust of wind. Thomas McKenna pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face, squinting through the heat shimmer that danced across the endless expanse of sagebrush and red stone. His horse, a tired bay mare named Dolly, plodded forward with the resigned patience of an animal that had learned to endure. 3 days without decent water, 5 days since his last real meal. The drought had claimed his cattle one by one, and now even the creek that had sustained his small ranch for 15 years had dried to nothing but cracked mud and the bones of fish. Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and felt the familiar weight of his last possession of value, a single piece of hardtack bread, wrapped in a torn piece of cloth. He'd been saving it, rationing hope along with sustenance. The canyon walls rose around him like cathedral spires, their red sandstone faces carved by millennia of wind and rare rainfall into impossible sculptures. This was sacred ground to the Apache, everyone knew that. But desperation made men cross boundaries they'd normally respect. Thomas had heard rumors of a hidden spring deep within the canyon, whispered stories shared by other failing ranchers in the saloon back in Tucson. As Dolly picked her way carefully along the narrow trail, Thomas caught sight of movement ahead. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or desert fox, but something about the stillness that followed made him dismount and approach on foot. The rocky ledge jutted out over 100-foot drop, and there, barely visible against the red stone, lay a bundle of faded cloth. Thomas's heart hammered as he crept closer. The bundle moved, a tiny, barely perceptible motion that spoke of life clinging to its final thread. He knelt beside it, his calloused hands trembling as he pulled back the thin blanket. A baby, no more than a year old, lay dehydrated and silent, its lips cracked and blue-tinged, dark eyes staring up at him with an exhaustion that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He looked around frantically, scanning the canyon walls and the trail behind him. No sign of anyone, no indication of how this child had come to be abandoned in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. The baby's breathing was shallow, labored. Thomas knew the signs. He'd seen them in his dying cattle, in the face of his own father during that last terrible winter. This child had hours, maybe less. Without hesitation, Thomas reached for his precious piece of hardtack. His stomach clenched with hunger, reminding him that this bread might be the difference between his own survival and death. But looking down at the baby's face, at the trust in those dark eyes, the choice became clear. He broke off a small piece of the bread and chewed it carefully, mixing it with what little saliva he could muster. The baby's mouth opened instinctively as Thomas gently placed the softened bread on its tongue. The child's throat worked slowly, swallowing with effort. "That's it, little one," Thomas murmured, breaking off another piece. "That's all I got, but it's yours." He gave the baby every last crumb, watching as color slowly returned to the tiny face. The child's breathing steadied, and for the first time, Thomas heard a soft whimper, the sound of life refusing to surrender. As he worked, Thomas felt eyes upon him. The sensation was unmistakable, the same feeling he'd had tracking deer through dense forest, the awareness that predator and prey had become aware of each other. But this felt different, not threatening, but watchful, respectful. High above, hidden among the red rocks and twisted juniper, a young Apache warrior named Ayana crouched motionless, his bronze skin blending perfectly with the stone around him. He had been tracking the white man for 2 days, curious about this stranger who dared enter sacred territory. But what he witnessed now challenged everything he thought he knew about the White Eyes and their selfish nature. The rancher's clothing was patched and worn, his boots held together with rawhide strips. This was not a wealthy man seeking to steal Apache treasures. This was a man who gave his last sustenance to a dying child, expecting nothing in return. Ayana watched as Thomas carefully lifted the baby, cradling it against his chest. The white man's eyes swept the canyon once more, searching for any sign of the child's family. Finding none, he began the slow process of sharing his own body heat with the infant, using his worn shirt to create a makeshift sling. "Don't know where you came from, little one," Thomas said softly, "but I reckon we're both lost souls now." The baby's tiny hand grasped Thomas's finger with surprising strength, and something shifted in the rancher's chest. The desperation that had driven him into this sacred place seemed to transform into something else, purpose, perhaps, or simply the recognition that some things mattered more than personal survival. As the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim, painting the walls in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas made his decision. He would carry this child to safety, even if it meant abandoning his search for water, even if it meant his own death. The baby had become his responsibility now, and Thomas McKenna had never walked away from a responsibility in his life. Above them, Ayana silently retreated deeper into the rocks, his mind racing with questions that would require the wisdom of the elders to answer. He had witnessed something that would change everything, not just for this white stranger, but for his entire people. The sacred canyon held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The Apache camp stirred with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to live in harmony with the desert's rhythms. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through the evening air, carrying the scent of roasted rabbit and wild onions. Children played between the wickiups, their laughter a stark contrast to the gravity that had settled over the adult members of the tribe since Ayana's return. The young warrior sat cross-legged before the council fire, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he recounted what he had witnessed in the sacred canyon. The 5 elders listened in silence, their weathered faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Each line etched into their skin told stories of survival, of battles fought and wisdom earned through decades of protecting their people. "He gave the child his last food," Ayana repeated, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. "I watched him chew the bread with his own saliva to soften it. The white eye was starving honored elders. His ribs showed through his shirt, his lips were cracked like dried clay. Yet he chose to feed the baby instead of himself." Nalnish, the oldest of the elders, steepled his fingers beneath his chin. At 73, he had lived through the worst years of conflict with the white settlers. He had seen his people driven from their ancestral lands, watched friends die from diseases brought by foreign tongues, witnessed the slow erosion of everything sacred. His trust in white men had been buried long ago with too many of his brothers. "You are certain of what you saw?" Nalnish asked, his voice like wind through dry grass. "As certain as I am of the sun's path across the sky," Ayana replied, without hesitation. The white eye could have taken the child to the settlement for a reward. He could have left it to die and continued his search for water. Instead, he wrapped the baby in his own shirt and began the journey back through the desert. He spoke to the child as a father would, with tenderness I have never seen from his kind. Takoda, the war chief, leaned forward. His scarred hands rested on his knees, and his dark eyes reflected the firelight like polished obsidian. "Many white eyes have entered our sacred places," he said slowly. "They come seeking gold, water, or simply to prove their dominance over land that is not theirs. But this one brought something different," finished Ayana. "I felt it in the way the canyon itself seemed to watch him. The wind stilled when he knelt beside the child. Even the ravens stopped their calling. Huyana, the medicine woman, rose from her position by the fire. Her long grey hair was braided with sacred beads, and her movements carried the authority of someone who had spent decades reading the signs that others missed. She walked to the edge of the firelight and stared out at the dark bulk of the canyon in the distance. "The child," she said without turning around. "Did you recognize the baby?" Ayana's throat tightened. "I could not be certain in the dying light, but the bone structure, the dark hair, it could be from the Chiricahua band that passed through 3 moons ago, the ones fleeing the soldiers." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The Chiricahua Apache had been hunted relentlessly by the U.S. Army, their numbers dwindling with each passing season. If this child was indeed from that band, it represented far more than just another life. It was a living link to bloodlines that stretched back to the beginning of the Apache people. "If the child dies," Huyana said, her voice barely above a whisper, "part of our people dies with it. If it lives—" She turned back to face the council. "Perhaps the spirits are testing us. Perhaps they sent this white eye as a message." Nalnish stood slowly, his joints protesting with soft pops and creaks. "In all my years, I have never seen the sacred canyon close to our people. It has been a place of refuge, of ceremony, of connection to our ancestors. To seal it would be to cut ourselves off from the very heart of our spiritual life. Yet consider what we have witnessed," said Itzel, the youngest of the elders. "A white man, starving and desperate, chose compassion over survival. He gave his last food to a child of our people. If we do nothing, If we allow this act to pass unmarked, what message does that send to the spirits? What message does it send to our own hearts? The debate that followed was conducted in the measured cadences of people who understood that hasty decisions could destroy nations. Each elder spoke in turn, weighing the unprecedented nature of their situation against the traditions that had guided their people for generations. Takoda argued for caution. One act of kindness does not erase centuries of broken promises and stolen land. How do we know this white eye will not speak of what he has seen? How do we know he will not return with others, seeking to exploit our sacred places? But Huyana countered with equal passion. The spirits do not send us signs to be ignored. This man's compassion awakened something in the canyon itself. Ayana felt it. I can see it in his eyes. To dismiss this as mere coincidence would be to turn our backs on the very wisdom that has kept our people alive. As the night deepened and the stars emerged in their full desert glory, the council reached a decision that would echo through both Apache and white communities for generations to come. The sacred canyon would be closed, not as punishment for the white man's intrusion, but as protection for the sacred act of compassion that had taken place within its walls. "We will seal the canyon at dawn," Nalnish announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "No Apache will enter until the child's fate is known. If the White Eye's act of kindness saves the baby's life, then perhaps the spirits will show us how to honor both his courage and our own traditions." "And the White Eye himself?" asked Takoda. The old chief's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "He will be brought to us, not as a prisoner, but as someone who has earned the right to hear our words. His actions in the canyon have created a debt that can only be repaid through understanding." Ayana bowed his head in acceptance of what he knew would be his next task. As the council dispersed and the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of night, he prepared for the journey that would bring Thomas McKenna face to face with the consequences of his simple act of human kindness. The sacred canyon stood silent under the stars, holding its secrets close, waiting for the morning that would change everything for both peoples forever. Dawn broke over the desert with the gentle persistence of water seeping through stone. Thomas McKenna had spent the night huddled against a boulder, using his own body heat to keep the baby warm, while Dolly grazed on the sparse grass growing in the shadow of the canyon wall. The child had survived the night, weak but breathing steadily, occasionally making soft sounds that Thomas chose to interpret as contentment. He was preparing to continue his journey toward the distant settlement when the soft scrape of moccasins on stone announced that he was no longer alone. Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, then stopped as he realized his gun belt lay several feet away. More importantly, he realized that any sudden movement might startle the baby in his arms. Ayana emerged from behind a cluster of red rocks, with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh landscape. He was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build of a warrior, and eyes that seemed to hold depths Thomas couldn't fathom. Most significantly, his hands were empty of weapons, extended slightly in a gesture that spoke of cautious peace. "White Eye," Ayana said in careful English, his accent giving the words a musical quality. "I have watched you through the night. You did not abandon the child." Thomas tightened his protective grip on the baby, his weathered face showing a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. "Didn't see much choice in the matter," he replied honestly. "Child needed help. I gave what I could." "You gave more than you had to give," Ayana said, moving slowly closer. "My people have a saying, a man's true wealth is measured not by what he keeps, but by what he gives when he has nothing left to offer." The baby stirred in Thomas's arms, and both men fell silent, watching as the tiny face scrunched up in what might have been the beginning of a cry. Thomas began to rock gently, humming tunelessly under his breath, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him 40 years ago in a cabin in Missouri. "The elders wish to speak with you," Ayana said when the child had settled again. "They offer safe passage to our camp, food, and water. In return, they ask only for your words, to hear your story and to share theirs." Thomas studied the young Apache's face, searching for signs of deception or trap. What he found instead was something he hadn't expected: respect. "And if I refuse? Then you are free to go, but the child—" Ayana gestured toward the baby in Thomas's arms. "The child cannot survive the journey to your settlement. Not in this heat, not without proper care. Our medicine woman has skills that could save its life." The truth of this statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been so focused on his own act of rescue that he hadn't fully considered the impossibility of what lay ahead. A 2-day journey through desert heat, with no water, no food, and a baby who needed constant care. The child might survive another day, but certainly not much longer. "Your people," Thomas said slowly. "They won't take kindly to a white man in their camp. I've heard the stories about what's been happening between our peoples." Ayana's expression darkened for a moment, shadows of pain and anger flickering across his features. "Stories," he said. "Yes, there are many stories. Some true, some twisted by fear and hatred. But yesterday in the sacred canyon, you wrote a different story, one my people cannot ignore." The journey to the Apache camp took 3 hours, winding through hidden valleys and secret paths that Thomas would never have found on his own. Ayana led Dolly by the reins while Thomas rode, the baby cradled against his chest. Despite his initial fears, Thomas found himself impressed by the young warrior's knowledge of the desert. Every plant that might provide moisture, every rock formation that offered shade, every sign that spoke of water or danger. "The child," Thomas said as they paused to rest in the shade of a massive boulder. "Do you know where it came from?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "There are many Apache bands scattered across this land," he said finally. "Some live in peace on the reservations, others—" he shrugged. "Others choose to remain free no matter the cost. 3 moons ago, a band of Chiricahua passed through our territory. They were fleeing soldiers seeking safe passage to Mexico. Among them was a young woman with child." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The woman was ill when they arrived. Fever, weakness. Our medicine woman did what she could, but—" Ayana's voice trailed off. "The band could not wait. They had to keep moving or risk capture. The woman insisted they take her child to safety, but in the chaos of departure, the baby was left behind." Thomas finished, understanding flooding through him. "Hidden in the sacred canyon where no white soldiers would dare to search. The woman's brother was to return for the child when it was safe, but—" Ayana's hands clenched into fists. "The soldiers found their trail. There were no survivors." The weight of this revelation settled over Thomas like a lead blanket. The child in his arms wasn't just any abandoned baby. It was the last surviving member of an entire Apache band, carrying bloodlines and memories that stretched back generations. His simple act of kindness had saved not just a life, but a living piece of Apache heritage. As they crested a final ridge, the Apache camp spread out before them like a carefully orchestrated symphony of survival. Wickiups dotted the valley floor, their dome-shaped frames covered with hides and brush that blended seamlessly with the desert landscape. Cook fires sent thin streams of smoke into the clear air, and Thomas could see figures moving between the structures with the purposeful efficiency of people who had learned to live lightly on the land. The arrival of a white man in their camp created a ripple of tension that Thomas could feel even from a distance. Children were called inside. Weapons appeared in hands that had seemed empty moments before, and a circle of warriors formed around the camp's perimeter. But there was no panic, no immediate violence, only the careful watchfulness of people who had learned to evaluate threats before reacting to them. Nalnish waited in the center of the camp, his ancient frame wrapped in a blanket that bore the intricate patterns of generations of Apache weavers. Beside him stood Huyana, her medicine bag already prepared, her experienced eyes focused not on Thomas but on the child in his arms. "Welcome, White Eye," Nalnish said in English that carried the weight of formal ceremony. "I am Nalnish, keeper of the old ways. You have brought something precious to our people." Thomas dismounted carefully, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes upon him. "Name's Thomas McKenna," he said, his voice hoarse from the desert heat. "I found the child in the canyon. Seemed like the right thing to do, helping it." Huyana stepped forward, her movements carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "May I?" she asked, indicating the baby. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, then gently transferred the child to the medicine woman's experienced hands. The baby seemed to sense the change, stirring slightly but remaining calm, a reaction that caused murmurs of approval from the watching Apache. "This child," Huyana said, her voice carrying to every ear in the camp, "carries the blood of Cochise himself. The woman who bore him was the great chief's great-granddaughter. In saving this baby, you have preserved a direct link to the greatest of our war leaders." The silence that followed was profound. Even the desert wind seemed to pause, as if the very landscape was absorbing the significance of this moment. Thomas stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had unknowingly done. "I didn't know," he whispered. I couldn't let a child die." Nalnish nodded slowly. "And that, Thomas McKenna, is why you stand here as our guest rather than our prisoner. The spirits do not make mistakes. They place this child in your path not by accident, but by design." 3 days passed in the Apache camp, like a dream that Thomas McKenna wasn't sure he wanted to wake from. The baby, who Huyana had named Naiche, meaning the mischievous one in honor of another great Apache leader, grew stronger with each passing hour under the medicine woman's careful attention. Thomas found himself drawn to the child's recovery with an intensity that surprised him, spending hours watching the tiny face regain its natural color and the small hands grow steady enough to grasp his finger. On the 4th morning, as the desert sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and amber, Nalnish approached Thomas where he sat beside the baby's cradleboard. The old chief moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that the most important conversations required time and patience. "The child will live," Nalnish said, settling onto a woven mat beside Thomas. "Huyana says his spirit is strong, like his ancestor Cochise, but strength alone did not save him." Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the baby's peaceful face. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if I'd walked a different path that day, if I'd turned back before reaching the canyon." "But you did not turn back," Nalnish replied. "And that choice has changed more than just one child's fate." The old chief gestured toward the camp around them, where Thomas could see subtle changes in the way the Apache people moved and interacted. The initial tension of his arrival had given way to something he couldn't quite name, not acceptance exactly, but a cautious recognition that their world had shifted in ways that required new understanding. "For 40 years, Nalnish continued, I have watched my people struggle with the white man's presence in our ancestral lands. We have fought wars, signed treaties, broken promises, and buried too many of our young. The hatred between our peoples has grown like a poison that spreads through the spirit until it consumes everything it touches." Thomas felt the weight of that history settle on his shoulders. "I can't speak for all white men," he said quietly. "I can only speak for myself. And I can tell you that what I did in that canyon, I'd do it again, no matter what color the child's skin was." "I know," Nalnish said simply. "That is why you are still alive. That is why the sacred canyon remains closed, not as a barrier but as a protection for the sacred act that took place within its walls." Huyana approached them, carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft deer hide. "The child is strong enough to travel," she announced. "His body has healed and his spirit has accepted the life you gave him." Thomas's heart clenched with an emotion he couldn't name. "Travel where?" "That depends," Nalnish said, his ancient eyes studying Thomas's face with the intensity of someone reading a crucial message. "On what you choose to do with the gift the spirits have given you." The gift, Thomas realized, wasn't just the child's survival. It was the opportunity to build something new from the ruins of old hatreds. Over the past 3 days, he had learned more about Apache culture than he had in 15 years of living in their traditional territory. He had watched children play games that taught them to read the desert's moods, seen women weave baskets with patterns that told stories of their ancestors, observed warriors practice skills that had kept their people alive for generations. "I lost my ranch," Thomas said, the words coming out slowly as if he were discovering them for the first time. "Lost my cattle, my water, everything I thought mattered. But maybe—" He looked down at little Naiche, who was watching him with dark eyes that seemed far too wise for such a young face. "Maybe I was meant to lose those things so I could find something more important." Takoda, who had been silent throughout this conversation, stepped forward. "The child cannot return to his mother's people. They are gone. He cannot live alone in the white man's world. He would forget who he is. But perhaps—" The war chief's scarred face showed the first hint of a smile Thomas had seen from him. "Perhaps there is a third path." What followed was a conversation that would be remembered in Apache oral tradition for generations. Thomas McKenna, the failed rancher who had given his last bread to a dying child, became the first white man in living memory to be offered a place among the Apache people. Not as a prisoner, not as a curiosity, but as a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for too long. "You would raise the child as your own," Nalnish explained, "but he would grow up knowing his heritage, learning the ways of both peoples. You would live among us, learn our customs, teach us what wisdom the white world offers that could help our people survive. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, the first he had shed since burying his father years earlier. I don't know your ways. I don't speak your language. You speak the language that matters most, Huyana said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades healing bodies and souls. You speak the language of compassion. Everything else can be learned. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls when Thomas gave his answer. He would stay. He would raise Naiche as his own son, while ensuring the boy never forgot his Apache heritage. He would learn the old ways while sharing what knowledge he possessed about surviving in a world that was changing too rapidly for anyone to fully understand. In the months that followed, Thomas McKenna became a figure of legend throughout the Southwest. To the Apache, he was the white man who had proven that honor and compassion could exist in any heart willing to nurture them. To the white settlers, he was either a traitor or a curiosity, depending on their own capacity for understanding. The sacred canyon remained closed, but it had become something more than a forbidden place. It had become a symbol of the possibility that two peoples could find common ground in the simple recognition of shared humanity. Travelers passing through the area would sometimes see a white man and an Apache child walking together along the canyon rim, the man teaching the boy to read the desert signs while the child shared stories passed down through generations of his people. Naiche grew strong and proud, carrying within him the blood of great chiefs and the love of a man who had chosen compassion over survival. He learned to hunt with Apache skill and to write with a white man's pen, to speak the language of his ancestors, and to navigate the complex world of two cultures learning to coexist. Thomas McKenna never regretted his choice. The ranch he had lost seemed like a small price to pay for the family he had gained, and the role he had found as a bridge between worlds. He had entered the sacred canyon seeking water, and found something infinitely more valuable, the chance to prove that kindness could triumph over hatred, that love could build bridges where politics had only constructed walls. Years later, when other white men asked him about his life among the Apache, Thomas would always return to that moment in the canyon when he had chosen to give his last piece of bread to a dying child. I thought I was saving a baby, he would say, his weathered hands resting on Naiche's shoulders. Turns out he was saving me. The sacred canyon stood as a monument to that truth, its red walls holding the memory of a simple act of compassion that had changed the course of two people's history. And in the camp below, the sound of children's laughter, both Apache and the child who had bridged two worlds, echoed off the ancient stones, carrying hope into a future that neither culture could have imagined alone.